1847, the Cumberland Valley, Pennsylvania. A dirt-caked ledger was discovered beneath the rotted floorboards of an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a forgotten township called Ashford Hollow. The pages were brittle, stained with what appeared to be ink or something darker. Inside, written in two distinct handwritings, were entries that chronicled not the mundane records of farm life, but a chilling agreement between two siblings, a brother and sister who had pledged themselves to something unspeakable. The final entry, dated October 14th, 1847, read only this: "The covenant is sealed. What we have begun cannot be undone." Below it, two signatures, Elias Fenwick and Miriam Fenwick, written in blood. The ledger was handed over to local historians in 1923, buried in a university archive, and promptly forgotten until now. What were these two bound by? What did they do in the shadows of that isolated valley? And why did history choose to let their names fade into silence? Before we go further, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? I'd love to know who's diving into this darkness with me tonight. The discovery of the Fenwick ledger came during the demolition of what locals called the house on Craven Ridge. It had stood empty for over 70 years. No family claimed it. No deed existed in county records after 1850. The structure itself seemed cursed by neglect, windows shattered, roof caved in, walls blackened by a fire no one could remember. When contractors tore up the floors, they found more than rotted wood. Beneath the hearthstone lay a small iron box, locked and rusted shut. Inside were letters, a tarnished locket containing a lock of dark hair, and the ledger. The letters were addressed to no one. They spoke in riddles. They referenced the circle, the offering, and the flame that would not die. Historians at Franklin and Marshall College briefly examined the materials in 1924, noted them as curiosities of rural superstition, and filed them away. The Fenwick name appeared nowhere else in regional history. No birth records, no death certificates. It was as if Elias and Miriam Fenwick had existed only long enough to write their confession and then vanished. To understand what happened in Ashford Hollow, we must first understand the world that shaped it. The 1,840 seconds in rural Pennsylvania were years of transformation and tension. The region was still scarred by the aftermath of the Panic of 1837, an economic collapse that left farms foreclosed and families fractured. Communities turned inward. Desperation bred strange faiths. Itinerant preachers wandered the valleys, speaking of apocalypse and salvation. Some brought fire and brimstone Christianity. Others brought something older, whispers of rituals drawn from European folk magic, alchemical obsessions, and half-remembered pagan rites. In places like Ashford Hollow, isolated by dense forests and harsh winters, people sought control over an uncontrollable world. They made pacts with forces they believed governed fate. They believed in blood, in sacrifice, in the binding power of spoken oaths. Elias Fenwick was born in 1821, the eldest child of a modest farming family. Parish records from a nearby Lutheran church listed his baptism, but nothing more. His father, Nathaniel Fenwick, died in a logging accident when Elias was 14. His mother, Margaret, succumbed to typhoid fever 2 years later. That left Elias as the head of a failing household, responsible for the land and for his younger sister, Miriam, born in 1825. Neighbors described Elias as serious, withdrawn, and deeply protective of Miriam. He rarely spoke in town. He attended no church. When asked about his family's circumstances, he would say only that they managed. But they did not manage. Tax records show that by 1844, the Fenwick farm was behind on payments. Livestock had been sold off. Crops failed 2 seasons running. By all accounts, the siblings should have lost everything. Yet they did not. In fact, something changed. In the summer of 1845, the Fenwicks began to thrive. Miriam Fenwick was said to be beautiful in a way that unnerved people. Dark-haired, pale-skinned, with eyes that seemed too aware. She was educated unusual for a girl in that region and time. Some claimed she had been taught by a traveling tutor who stayed with the family one winter and then disappeared. Others whispered that she taught herself, devouring books on philosophy, medicine, and subjects no decent woman should study. Miriam was rarely seen in public, but when she was, people noticed. She carried herself with an eerie confidence. She smiled at things that were not funny, and she never, ever left her brother's side. Townsfolk assumed the two were simply close, bound by shared tragedy. But there were rumors, whispers of something unnatural. In a society obsessed with propriety and bloodlines, the Fenwicks' isolation began to feel like secrecy, and secrecy bred suspicion. The first sign that something was wrong came in the autumn of 1845. A neighboring farmer, Thomas Grayson, reported that 3 of his sheep had gone missing. He found them a week later at the edge of the Fenwick property, throat slit, arranged in a triangle with their heads pointing inward. The blood had been drained. Grayson confronted Elias, who denied any knowledge. No charges were filed. Evidence was circumstantial, and Grayson had no desire to provoke a man rumored to have a temper. But the incident marked the beginning. Over the following months, other animals disappeared. A hunting dog, a calf, a neighbor's prized rooster. Each time, the pattern was the same. Bloodless, arranged, found near Fenwick land. Locals began to avoid the ridge. Parents warned children not to wander near the old farmhouse. And still, the Fenwicks prospered. Their fields, which had been barren, now produced abundant harvests. Their debts were paid in full. Elias was seen in town purchasing supplies with money no one could explain. Then came the winter of 1846. A young woman named Abigail Marsh, 19 years old, vanished without a trace. She had been walking home from a church gathering on a cold December evening. Her path took her past Craven Ridge. She never arrived home. Search parties combed the woods for days. They found no body, no clothing, no sign of struggle. Abigail Marsh simply ceased to exist. Her family was devastated. The community was terrified. And fingers began to point toward the Fenwicks. There was no evidence, only suspicion, gut instinct, and the growing certainty that something evil lived on that ridge. A group of men, led by Abigail's father, marched to the Fenwick farmhouse demanding answers. Elias met them at the door, calm and cold. He claimed he had seen nothing, heard nothing. Miriam stood behind him, silent, watching. The men left empty-handed, but the encounter hardened their resolve. They began to keep watch. They noted the Fenwicks' movements, and they saw things that defied explanation. On certain nights, firelight flickered in the windows of the farmhouse long past midnight. Shadows moved in strange, rhythmic patterns. Neighbors reported hearing chanting, low, guttural, in no language they recognized. One man claimed to have seen figures in the yard, standing in a circle, wearing dark robes. Another swore he heard screaming, abruptly cut short, but no one dared approach. Fear had taken root. The Fenwicks had become something more than suspects. They had become symbols of a darkness that the community could not name but deeply felt. The winter dragged on. Another disappearance occurred, this time a drifter, a man passing through who had been seen near the Fenwick property. He was never seen again. The pattern was undeniable. The Fenwicks were at the center of something monstrous. By spring of 1847, whispers of witchcraft spread through the valley. The word was not used lightly. This was a deeply Christian community, and accusations of witchcraft carried the weight of damnation. Yet people spoke it anyway. They spoke of curses, of pacts with the devil, of rituals that bound souls to dark powers. A traveling minister arrived in Ashford Hollow and preached a sermon on the dangers of consorting with evil. He did not name the Fenwicks, but everyone knew. Attendance at his revival meetings swelled. Prayers were said. Protective charms were hung on doorways. But nothing stopped the Fenwicks. If anything, they grew bolder. Miriam was seen walking alone at dusk, singing to herself, her voice carrying across the empty fields. Elias appeared in town less and less. But when he did, his eyes held a strange intensity, as if he saw through people rather than at them. The siblings had crossed a line, and they knew it. They no longer pretended to belong. Then, in early October 1847, something happened that would seal their fate and ensure their story would be buried. A child went missing. 7-year-old Samuel Cotter, son of a local miller, disappeared while playing near the creek that bordered Fenwick land. His mother found his cap floating in the water. The entire township mobilized. Men armed themselves. This time, there would be no polite knocking. This time, they would force the truth. But when the mob arrived at Craven Ridge on the night of October 13th, 1847, they found the farmhouse empty. The door hung open. Inside, the rooms were in disarray, furniture overturned, candles burned down to stubs. strange symbols drawn on the walls in ash and what appeared to be blood. In the center of the main room, a circle had been painted on the floor. Within it, remnants of a fire. And scattered around the room, pages torn from books written in Latin, German, and scripts no one could identify. But no Elias, no Miriam, and no Samuel Cotter. The search for Elias and Miriam Fenwick became the largest manhunt in Cumberland Valley history. Local law enforcement, assisted by volunteers from neighboring townships, scoured the woods, searched abandoned barns, questioned every traveler on every road. They found nothing. It was as if the siblings had dissolved into the autumn mist. But the investigation inside the farmhouse revealed far more than anyone expected, and far more than anyone wanted to believe. Sheriff Daniel Whitcomb, a practical man not given to superstition, conducted a methodical examination of the property. What he documented in his official report would later be suppressed, edited, and finally lost to bureaucratic neglect. But fragments of his notes survived, tucked into the margins of county ledgers and preserved in private letters written to a colleague in Philadelphia. The symbols on the walls were not random. Whitcomb brought in a professor from Dickinson College who identified some as alchemical sigils, representations of transformation, binding, and transmutation of matter. Others resembled protective wards from medieval grimoires, texts that blended Christian mysticism with pre-Christian ritual magic. One symbol, drawn above the fireplace in what was confirmed to be human blood, matched an illustration from a banned 16th century manuscript known as the Clavicula Noctis, the Key of Night, a text associated with forbidden practices that purportedly allowed practitioners to bargain with forces beyond the mortal realm. The professor left Ashford Hollow the same day he arrived, refusing payment and asking never to be contacted again. Whitcomb noted in his journal, "What we found was not the work of madness, but of method." These two knew exactly what they were doing. The ledger discovered under the floorboards was the most damning piece of evidence. It was not merely a record, it was a ritual chronicle. The entries began in late 1844, shortly after a particularly brutal winter that had nearly destroyed the Fenwick farm. The handwriting alternated between Elias and Miriam, sometimes within the same entry, as if they were taking turns or completing each other's thoughts. The early pages describe desperation. "We have nothing. The land yields nothing. Death waits at our door." Then, abruptly, the tone changed. An entry from March 1845 read, "We have been offered a way. The stranger came at midnight. He spoke of power, of exchange, of debts paid not in coin but in devotion. We listened. We agreed. The first offering was made beneath the full moon. The blood was our own." The entries became increasingly cryptic and disturbing, references to the circle of binding, the flame that does not consume, and the names we must never speak aloud. Each ritual was documented with clinical precision dates, phases of the moon, materials used, words spoken, and each ritual was followed by a tangible result. Crops flourished, money appeared, their fortunes reversed. But the ledger also revealed the cost. By the summer of 1846, the rituals required more than the siblings' own blood. "We have been told that the covenant deepens only through sacrifice," Miriam wrote. "What is freely given holds no power. What is taken against its will, that is the currency of the unseen." The entries that followed describe the acquisition of animals, the precise method of their deaths, the collection and use of their blood and organs. Elias wrote with detachment, "The sheep yielded well. The circle accepted the offering. We felt the presence grow stronger." Miriam's entries were more emotional, almost ecstatic. "I have seen what lies beyond the veil. It is not heaven, nor is it hell. It is something older, something that existed before names were given to gods, and it knows us now. It wants more." The disappearance of Abigail Marsh was never directly mentioned in the ledger, but an entry dated December 20th, 1846, 2 days after she vanished, contained a chilling passage written in Miriam's hand. "The circle demanded a greater offering. Elias hesitated, but I did not." The girl was willing, though she did not know it. Her fear made the ritual stronger. The flame burned brighter than ever before. "We have crossed a threshold. There is no returning." Whitcomb's hands reportedly shook when he read those words. He ordered the ledger locked away. He instructed his deputies to say nothing of its contents. The official report listed Abigail Marsh as a victim of exposure or wild animals. Her family never learned the truth. The investigation reached a dead end by November 1847. No bodies were recovered. Samuel Cotter was never found. Elias and Miriam Fenwick had vanished as completely as their victims. The farmhouse on Craven Ridge was seized by the county, but no one would purchase it. It stood empty, slowly decaying, a monument to unspoken horror. Locals avoided the area. Stories spread. Some claimed to hear voices on windless nights. Others saw lights moving through the trees where no path existed. In 1852, a fire of unknown origin consumed part of the structure, but even that did not erase the place. It lingered, cursed by memory and fear. By the 1872nd, Ashford Hollow itself began to fade. Families moved away. The township lost its charter. The name disappeared from maps. The Fenwick case became a ghost story, then a rumor, then nothing at all. But the story does not end with their disappearance. In the years that followed, strange accounts emerged from across Pennsylvania and into neighboring states, accounts that suggest Elias and Miriam Fenwick may not have stopped. In 1849, a brother and sister matching their descriptions were reported in a small village in upstate New York, living under the names Elijah and Mary Finch. They kept to themselves, appeared to have money, and left abruptly after a local child went missing. In 1853, two siblings were seen in a town near the Ohio border, this time calling themselves Emmett and Margaret Fenton. Again, disappearances followed their arrival. Again, they vanished before authorities could act. The pattern repeated across decades, always a brother and sister, always isolated, always preceded by prosperity and followed by tragedy. Were these the Fenwicks continuing their covenant under new identities? Or were they merely echoes, doppelgangers, conjured by a society hungry for explanations? One particularly credible account came from a retired schoolteacher in Erie, Pennsylvania, who in 1889 wrote a letter to a regional newspaper describing an encounter she had in 1861. She claimed that a woman matching Miriam Fenwick's description had arrived in her town, presenting herself as a widow seeking work. The woman was hired to assist in the schoolhouse. She was intelligent, well-spoken, and unsettling. Her eyes were wrong, the teacher wrote. They looked at you as if measuring something invisible. The children feared her, though she never raised her voice or hand. The woman stayed for 3 months. During that time, 2 students fell gravely ill with a wasting sickness that baffled doctors. Both recovered after the woman left town suddenly, in the middle of the night, taking nothing with her. The teacher later found a book hidden in the woman's room, a handwritten journal filled with symbols identical to those found in the Fenwick farmhouse. She burned it immediately and never spoke of it again until her letter, written decades later, as a deathbed confession. The most disturbing evidence, however, came to light in 1901, when a historian named Thomas Hargrove was researching rural folklore for a university project. He stumbled upon the Fenwick ledger in the Franklin and Marshall archives, misfiled under agricultural records. Hargrove became obsessed. He tracked down descendants of the original Ashford Hollow families, interviewed elderly residents who remembered the stories, and pieced together a timeline that spanned over 50 years. What he discovered shook him. Hargrove found at least 12 separate incidents between 1847 and 1895 involving a brother and sister who appeared suddenly in isolated communities, lived prosperously despite having no visible means of income, and left abruptly following unexplained disappearances or deaths. The physical descriptions varied slightly, but certain details remained consistent. The woman's dark hair and pale skin, the man's intense gaze, their unnatural closeness, and their habit of avoiding churches and public gatherings. Hargrove compiled his findings into a manuscript titled The Covenant Keepers, A Study in Perpetual Evil. He submitted it to 3 academic publishers. All 3 rejected it. One editor wrote back, "Your research is thorough, but your conclusions are untenable. You are suggesting that 2 individuals committed atrocities across half a century, without aging, without capture, without leaving any physical evidence. This is folklore, Mr. Hargrove, not history." Discouraged and increasingly paranoid, Hargrove abandoned the project. His manuscript was never published. It resides today in a private collection, accessible only by special request. The question that haunted Hargrove, and that haunts us still, is this: what exactly did Elias and Miriam Fenwick bind themselves to? The ledger provides clues, but no clear answers. The rituals they performed were not drawn from a single tradition. They were a hybrid, a synthesis of alchemical transformation, blood magic, folk ritual, and something else, something that predated organized religion. The stranger who visited them in 1845 was never described in detail, but Miriam's entries suggest he was not entirely human. "He did not walk," she wrote. "He moved as shadow moves, without sound, without weight. His voice was many voices. When he spoke our names, we felt them change. We are no longer who we were." This passage, more than any other, suggests that the covenant was not merely a transaction, but a transformation, a remaking of identity, and perhaps even of flesh. Modern occult scholars, the few who have examined the Fenwick case, propose several theories. Some believe the siblings invoked an egregore, a thought form created and sustained by concentrated will and ritual, which gains independence and power through sacrifice. Others suggest they made contact with an entity from older, pre-Christian belief systems, a spirit of the land, a genius loci that demanded blood in exchange for favor. Still others, more skeptical, argue that Elias and Miriam were simply sociopaths who used occult trappings to justify and ritualize their crimes, and that any subsequent sightings were either coincidence or mass hysteria. But none of these explanations account for the physical evidence, the symbols that matched texts the Fenwicks could not have accessed, the consistency of sightings across decades, the strange vitality and prosperity that followed them wherever they went. The most chilling aspect of the Fenwick case is not what we know, but what we can never know. The covenant they made, whatever it was, remains sealed in silence. No confession was ever extracted. No witness ever testified to seeing the rituals performed. The victims, if indeed they were victims of the Fenwicks, took their final moments to unmarked graves or places unknown. The ledger, our only window into their minds, ends abruptly on October 14th, 1847, with those haunting words, "The covenant is sealed. What we have begun cannot be undone." What did they mean? Was this a declaration of permanence, a recognition that they had crossed a point of no return? Or was it something more literal, a binding so complete that death itself could not break it? In 1978, a construction crew working on a highway expansion project near the site of Old Ashford Hollow unearthed something that reignited interest in the case. Buried 6 feet beneath what had once been the Fenwick property line, they found a stone chamber roughly 8 feet square, walls lined with slate, ceiling intact despite over a century underground. Inside were the skeletal remains of 3 individuals, 2 adults and 1 child. The bones were arranged in a deliberate pattern, forming a triangle with the child's remains at the apex. Surrounding them were remnants of fabric, rusted iron implements, and fragments of what appeared to be ceremonial vessels. The discovery made local news briefly, but the remains were never positively identified. Carbon dating placed them in the mid-19th century. Forensic analysis revealed that all 3 individuals had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. The child's bones showed signs of malnutrition and chronic illness before death. The adults, 1 male, 1 female, had been in excellent health at the time of their deaths. DNA testing was not yet available in 1978, and by the time it became standard, their remains had been reburied in an unmarked county plot, and their exact location lost to administrative oversight. Researchers who learned of the discovery decades later tried to locate the bones for modern analysis, but cemetery records were incomplete and conflicting. Some believe the remains were those of Elias and Miriam Fenwick, and one of their victims placed together in some final ritual. Others argue that the Fenwicks themselves performed the burial as part of their covenant, sacrificing 3 individuals in a single ceremony before fleeing. A third theory, more unsettling, suggests that the remains belonged to victims only, and that the Fenwicks were never in that chamber at all. If that is true, then what happened to Elias and Miriam? Did they die elsewhere, their bones scattered and lost? Or did something far stranger occur? There is one final piece of evidence, discovered in 2003, that has never been adequately explained. A graduate student researching 19th century census records in the Pennsylvania State Archives found a notation in an 1880 census document from a town called Millbridge, nearly 200 miles from Ashford Hollow. Listed among the residents were E. Fenwick, age 35, farmer, and M. Fenwick, age 31, housewife. The census taker had added a marginal note in faded ink. Residents claimed to be siblings. Appearance unusual, both look much younger than stated ages. Keep no company. Declined to answer several questions. The graduate student traced property records and found that the Fenwicks of Millbridge had purchased a small farm in 1878, paid in cash, and lived there until 1882, when they sold the property abruptly and disappeared. No further records exist. If these were indeed Elias and Miriam Fenwick, born in 1821 and 1825 respectively, they would have been 59 and 55 years old in 1880, not 35 and 31. Yet the census taker noted they appeared young. How is this possible? Clerical error? Mistaken identity? Or something else? The psychological profile of Elias and Miriam, constructed from the fragments of their ledger and the testimonies of those who knew them, reveals two individuals who were not insane but utterly convinced of a hidden reality beneath the surface of the world. Elias emerges as the protector, the elder sibling driven by desperation to keep his family alive. His entries are pragmatic, detached, focused on results. He did not revel in the rituals, he endured them as necessary. But Miriam was different. Her writings pulse with a kind of dark ecstasy. She did not merely participate in the covenant. She embraced it. She saw in those rituals a liberation from the constraints of ordinary life, a doorway into forbidden knowledge and power. "We are not bound by the laws that govern lesser souls," she wrote. "We have been chosen, or we have chosen ourselves. It matters not. What matters is that we see what others cannot, and we act where others fear to tread." This is not the language of madness. It is the language of zealotry, of total commitment to a belief system that supersedes morality. What drove them to this path? The ledger hints at an answer. Both Elias and Miriam had experienced profound loss and helplessness. Their parents' deaths left them alone in a hostile world, facing poverty and social invisibility. In their isolation, they turned inward, and in that inward turn, they found something, or something found them. The stranger who appeared in 1845 may have been a wandering occultist, a charlatan, or something genuinely otherworldly. But what matters is that the Fenwicks believed. They believed that power existed beyond the reach of law and religion. They believed that sacrifices could reshape reality. And they acted on that belief with a discipline and determination that carried them beyond the boundaries of the known world. The reaction of the Ashford Hollow community reveals much about how societies cope with incomprehensible evil. Rather than confront the full horror of what the Fenwicks represented, the townspeople chose erasure. The case was not pursued beyond the initial investigation. The ledger was hidden away. The farmhouse was left to rot, and the name Fenwick was systematically removed from local memory. By the 1,860 seconds, children growing up in the valley had never heard the story. By the 1,880 seconds, even the elderly spoke of it only in whispers, if at all. This was not forgetting, it was deliberate suppression, a collective decision to bury the past rather than face its implications. Because to acknowledge the Fenwicks fully would be to acknowledge that evil is not always loud and obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, sometimes it is methodical, sometimes it wears the face of ordinary people who simply choose to step outside the circle of humanity. The families of the victims, Abigail Marsh, Samuel Cotter, and the others whose disappearances may be linked to the Fenwicks, were denied closure. Abigail's father died in 1855, still searching for his daughter's remains. Samuel Cotter's mother lived until 1891, never knowing what happened to her son. These people carried their grief in silence, unsupported by a community that wanted only to move on. The emotional toll extended beyond the immediate families. Neighbors who had suspected the Fenwicks, but done nothing, wrestled with guilt. Those who had participated in the mob that stormed the farmhouse wondered if they could have acted sooner. The trauma fractured the community, and Ashford Hollow's eventual dissolution can be traced, in part, to the unhealed wound left by the Fenwick case. Beyond the families and the town, the Fenwick story has had a lingering impact on American folklore and occult history. Though largely forgotten by mainstream culture, the case is well known in certain circles, scholars of esoteric traditions, researchers of unsolved crimes, and those who study the intersection of ritual and violence. The Fenwick ledger has been referenced in academic papers on folk magic, cited in books on American occultism, and analyzed by criminal psychologists interested in shared delusions and folie à deux. But these examinations remain niche, hidden in specialized journals and out-of-print monographs. The broader public knows nothing of Elias and Miriam Fenwick. Their names do not appear in encyclopedias of crime or documentaries on unsolved mysteries. They exist in the margins, shadows of history that flicker briefly when someone curious enough digs deep enough. The question that haunts every investigator who has touched this case is simple and terrible. Did the Fenwicks succeed? Did their covenant grant them what they sought: power, longevity, escape from the mortal condition? The evidence is circumstantial, maddening in its ambiguity. The sightings across decades, always a brother and sister, always fleeing after tragedy. The census record showing impossibly young ages. The stone chamber with its carefully arranged dead. The ledger's final, absolute declaration. What are we to make of this? Skeptics dismiss it all as coincidence, misidentification, and the human tendency to find patterns in chaos. Believers see something darker, a ritual that worked, a covenant that held two souls who found a crack in reality and slipped through, leaving only suffering in their wake. In the end, we are left with silence. The Fenwicks have not been seen, at least not under that name, since the 19th century. If they lived beyond their natural years, they have either finally died or learned to hide so completely that no trace remains. The victims are still missing. The rituals are still unexplained. The covenant, whatever it was, remains sealed. History has done what the people of Ashford Hollow could not. It has buried the story so deep that most will never find it. But it is there, waiting in archives and forgotten ledgers, in the ruins of a farmhouse on a ridge no one visits, in the questions that have no answers. Why do some truths remain buried? Perhaps because we cannot bear to face what they reveal about the darkness within ordinary lives. Perhaps because the world is more fragile than we want to believe, and some knowledge threatens the foundations on which we build our sense of safety. Or perhaps because some stories are not meant to end. They are meant to linger, unresolved, reminding us that not everything can be explained, controlled, or understood. The Fenwicks made a choice that defied every moral and natural law. They pursued power through blood and darkness. And somewhere, in some form, their covenant endures. So I ask you now, what do you believe? Do you think Elias and Miriam Fenwick died in obscurity, their crimes unpunished, their pact a delusion? Or do you believe that some doors once opened can never be closed? That some covenants transcend death itself? The evidence is here. The questions are here. The truth, if it exists, remains hidden in the space between what we can prove and what we fear. If this story has unsettled you, if it has made you question what lies beneath the surface of forgotten history, then share it. Let others grapple with the mystery. Subscribe to dive deeper into the cases that history tried to erase. And leave a comment. Tell me what you think happened to the Fenwicks. Are they gone? Or are they still out there, wearing new names, performing old rituals, keeping a covenant that will not die? Because some mysteries are never solved, some questions are never answered, and some shadows, once cast, never fade.